I want to go through today and put together a laundry list of blind spots. I think there's like some stuff that people don't miss that is apparently obvious, and maybe it's not. Maybe it'll get added to the list. But I want to go through you and I and do, okay, here's the reason you're not growing in muscle. Here are your blind spots. What first comes to mind when you go, people aren't gaining muscle? Here's the battery of questions I'm going to ask them.
Yeah, yeah, that's. I mean, I'll kind of shock on that one. With the question is for me, number one is what are you doing? Every single time someone tells me, like even as like a provider, like people come to me as I've tried everything, whether that's to fix their back pain, their knee pain, whether that's to grow muscle, to lose weight. No, you fucking haven't. You've thought of trying everything. You've done a few things and they haven't worked and you've given up. Like the first thing I'll always ask someone is what are you doing? And not what do you want to do? What are you actually doing? Because I don't think it's hard to build muscle if you're doing the right things, if you're controlling the right variables. But it breaks down to three categories in my mind. There's nutrition, there's training, and there's recovery. Right? It's outside of that, if you can control those three things, and there's a lot to control within those three categories, but that's going to be what dictates your body composition, no matter what, period. Whether it's gaining muscle, whether it's losing fat, you need to control those three things. And if you're not controlling those three things, then you might be working out really hard, because I think that's where a lot of people approach this from, is that maybe they don't understand they need to control these things, or maybe they're lazy, or maybe it's just something that they don't know how to do on their own. But they start with training, right? They think if I want to gain muscle, I need to work out. And working out harder is a very ambiguous term. And I think people they do it in the wrong way, especially, period, just blanket statement, but they don't have the right intention when growing muscle. They don't have the right intention in exercise when they're trying to grow muscle. I guess is what I'm trying to say. Your workouts have to be hard. They have to hurt. You have to push yourself further than you have. I think a lot of people they kind of put themselves on autopilot when they're training, and they'll go through kind of the same routine, push pull legs, or whatever their split is, and they'll just go through the same thing over and over again, maybe like slight progressions here and there, but they're not actually training with the intention of getting better. Maybe they're training with the intention of what they think might be getting better or growing muscle, or the classical examples, they're just trying to go heavier on everything, which isn't necessarily how you grow muscle. And I think there's just a lack of understanding around what you need to do in training, and also how hard you need to push yourself in training, depending on where you're at, kind of on the spectrum of your athletic lifespan or your training age. So I think that's probably the one that's the most bastardized, but just as like close behind that, because it's less intuitive, I think is nutrition. Is that people just they're they're unwilling to do what it takes, or they have unrealistic expectations around the way that the process works. Like if you want to gain muscle, you need to be eating in a caloric surplus, and they need to be the right calories, not just a bunch of cupcakes. You need to eat a ton of protein. Um, so that's difficult, and that's difficult to do on a continual, consistent basis, which it takes to grow muscle. Is that you don't just do the stuff, when it's convenient. You do the stuff for 12, 16, 20, 24 weeks consecutively, like with a level of consistency. And that's going to be those are the two things that I think most people can look into or learn more about to make the biggest difference in this. And recovery is important, but I think that is pretty well standardized for most people. They have the sleep routine they have the work routine, the stress management techniques that they have. So even if it's shit, like, yes, we can improve it and we can make it better. But I think that is pretty well standardized, where these other two, you can make pretty big differences in, the actual amount of muscle mass someone has by dialing those in.
Yeah, I think there's the thing that, like, I think it's, you've put a really good, like, fine border around all of the things that move the needle, right? So training, nutrition, and recovery. And the thing is, I think the thing that people miss is the how those are interconnected,
Yes.
right? And I think it should all funnel, and this is tough. And look, I'm even guilty of this. Like there are times where I don't sleep well. I training to me, I don't want to say is so autopilot, but it's so habitual that
Mhm.
it's oftentimes I forget what feeling good when I train feels like. Like it's
Mhm.
very rare that I have all of my ducks in a row where like I got good sleep, my nutrition's where it should be, hydration's where it should be, which you could put under nutrition or recovery. And there's been some sort of recovery effort worthy of my training efforts to help augment and but I forget what performing well in the gym feels like a lot of the time until like the stars align once or twice a year and I like find a bathhouse, I get 12 hours of sleep, I, get all my protein in and I like, I don't travel for more than a couple of days and I get in the gym and I go, holy shit, like I can actually fucking move. Like I can perform. And it's to me, it's, because I do it anyways because I do it habitually, because I've done it for so long in various states of preparedness for each session, I just show up and do it. And it's so much so that I don't even think about it. Cause like I don't get discouraged when I don't have bad sessions. I would get discouraged if I was missing sessions,
Yeah.
but I would miss sessions if I got discouraged by sessions. Like, I don't want to fucking do this, which like I understand. So like the thing that I think when I talk to people about why they're not building muscle is that I just don't think they know how to aim each one of those things. And I think if you always set your sights on performance, right? Like I know people who sleep too much. And the best thing that they've done is cutting their sleep back.
Yeah, I hate
And
those people.
I don't know how they operate in the world as panda bears who also pay their taxes. It's like, how do you get and like I honestly think they're smart because like, oh, you can get done in 10 waking hours what takes me 20 waking hours to do. It must be how the calculus works out. But it's like people oversleep and they're groggy and they're tired and their performance is shit. It's like you sleep for fucking 13 hours and you're an accountant. Like, why do you sleep for 13 hours? Like, let's trim that down incrementally. Right. So because performance is it's an equalizer. So if you're too up or down in one of those categories, we need to look at the performance as the indicator of which direction we need to move you. Now, obviously for most people, the nutrition is the macros are too high, your overall calories are too high or too low, right? Your macros are way off, fats and carbs are too high, protein is too low. But you need to adjust that, right? Some people's calorie intake is too low and they train like shit. And then you give them fucking the adequate amount of calories and they're like, oh my God, I feel like fucking Superman, right? Some people are way too high and they're way too, their calories are way too high and they're way too fat. And then you start to trim them down a bit and they're like, well, I'm getting stronger, but I'm getting lighter. It's like, yeah, because it's like we're actually fueling your workouts with what you need.
Mhm.
Then when you look at the training side itself, adjusting training volume, intensity, frequency, all of the variables to align with this central north star of performance, right? So it becomes it's like just a test and retest. It's like, but what to test and retest against, I think is people get lost in, right? How do you know if it's working? It's like, how do you feel and what are your objective numbers when you're training? And obviously not on everything, but like, are you getting more reps? Are you getting more sets? Are you doing more dense work? Like, are you doing more work in less time? All of these things, albeit conceptually easy to silo and just be like, okay, nutrition, sleep, and or sorry, nutrition, sleep, and or so sleep is part of recovery and training. These side of like three buckets. Those are easy to talk about each one, but like your nutrition, and this is where more complex details like nutrition timing and macro and micronutrient timing play a huge role, right? And this is where you see limitations in certain approaches to nutrition because they're not geared for performance, right? Like, the if it fits your macros, I think, I mean, it's kind of gone away. Not that like macro counting doesn't hold weight, but I think the the potency and the effect of micronutrition density has really put a damper on the IIFYM movement because of performance,
Yeah.
right? I don't know if that's true, but I feel as if IIFYM is not what it used to be.
I haven't seen that hashtag since like maybe 2016 or so, which is I think a good sign. And I think a lot of that is because of eh, as the baseline for available information becomes more accepted, like I think people understand now that like, okay, it's not just like how much fat you eat, but like what kind of fats are you eating? Or like, how are you digesting the carbohydrates? What's your fiber intake? Like I think there's things that are more kind of base level knowledge that were a little bit more advanced maybe 10 years ago, that people are like, oh yeah, but like if it fits your macros, you'll get progress or you'll see results in your aesthetics, which yeah, you probably will. But now like I don't know too many people that 10, 15 years ago were looking at blood labs for just general fitness goals, right? Like you can tell like, oh no, I'm vitamin D deficient. Like I don't have enough folate. Like there's other things like other markers outside of like scale weight that I think people are paying attention to now and understanding the dietary correlations to those things. So I think that's kind of what's led to the downfall of that is like, no, you can't just eat like 13 donuts and have 6 protein shakes and that's your macros for the day.
Yeah, and the reason that is because you can't perform,
Right.
right? At a
Yeah.
certain point, your glass ceiling of your physique, and this is true. Like if you don't train and you hit a certain, you're in a calorie deficit, but that calorie deficit is composed of a macronutrient ratio that's heavier in protein. Your body composition will be different than that if it was situated with a higher concentration of fat or carbohydrates. Period. Right? Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
if you're gonna just not train or train like shit and not worry about performance, then even still the potency of that deficit will change as far as the outcome of body composition based off of your macronutrition ratio. So when you look at the classic, the Rice Krispie square eating anime sock fucking powerlifter, it's like, one, are you eating for the energy system that you're using, right? Like what good does available carbohydrates have to do for anyone who's running less than 20 miles, right? You're lifting 3 reps, and I frankly, it's not that heavy. So there's a lot that goes into assessing the efficacy of your nutrition, but to streamline it for people who are struggling losing muscle, it's like focus on a few lifts that are progressible. Maybe one or two a session that makes sense to progress, that can be progressed on a relatively infinite scale. If you're starting on a bar, it's a pretty good place to start. Bar collars are pretty long, and they're long because they can add a lot of plates, right? Like, this is not a flex, but unfortunately, most machines I go on aren't heavy enough.
That's kind of a flex.
So here's the thing. I had a rich friend tell me this once. He goes, all flexes are subtle flexes. And I was like, that in itself was a flex. You got that much money? He's like, yeah, dude, like the jet, whatever. It's not that much if you got it. Right. So that's a real flex. Because if you're fronting or you're just squeezing by, then it's not actually a flex. You're just a front. And I thought that was, but it's like, no, like I go to a gym and there's like Atlanta stuff and there's like Prime stuff. And I can throw plates on or I can put the pin in, and it's like, we're done here. Like, okay, I'm just going to do more of this now. But understand, like the weight on the bar, I can't, there's not a situation where there's a lift that I would do with a barbell that I could load up the entire bar. So
Yeah.
that's where a lot of my training goes, right? Like I used to do this progression when I would get back into hinging when I was on the road a lot. I would just take dumbbells and I would take the dumbbells into as heavy as they got for my hinges. And then once I did that, I moved on to a bar.
Yeah.
And I was like, the dumbbell rack ends at, I don't know, like 150, 200, and I got 200 in each hand. It's like, great. Now the bar can more than accommodate for 405, 4 plates aside on a bar. And now I just keep going with that.
Mhm.
Right. So I think, when we look at these buckets and, there's opportunities within each one, certainly for recalibration towards your goal, you need to look at how are these interconnected? What is the vein that ties all these together? And I think for most people, performance is the one that's most overlooked, right? You talked about scale weight. That's often like top of the list. Am I getting bigger? Am I getting smaller? It's like you're going to have such a fluctuation in putting on muscle tissue, burning body fat, storing more glycogen, maybe storing just more overall water, sleeping more, eating less, that like scale weight in the early stages of this, it's noise. It's not a true signal for like months, 4 months, 6 months. You're not really going to get a stabilization of that as a useful metric for some time, right?
Yeah.
Like you're going to be eating and drinking to fuel your performance, to recover from your performance, to then subsequently perform again. And it's not a great metric. Now, if we know like we're supposed to be in a deficit and all our various variables should be equated for, and we're going up, it's like, well, we're not eating at a deficit. So there's obviously a utility to it. But I think looking at the furthest horizon, the thing that's going to give you the most return on your investment of attention is going to be performance. And I think the takeaway I want to see is you can be on either side, right? You can be, hey, look, I know people who undereat on protein and their performance suffers and the recovery suffers and their performance suffers because the recovery suffers. I know people who undereat the fuck out of carbohydrates and you give them a fucking 100 grams of carbs before they train and it's like they just fucking snorted an 8 ball. And you're just like, all right, so it's not just enough to say, and not that it's just not just enough, but people get confused and they don't know how to assess what side of the problem they're on, right?
Right.
And then
Right.
performance helps calibrate that for you. Because in worst case, you can be like, okay, my protein is this. And we can look at baselines. I prefer most people at a gram per kilogram of body weight. If you're lifting long term, I think that's pretty well
Gram
the
per
way to
pound.
go. Oh,
Right.
sorry, a gram per pound. Yeah, yeah. A gram per pound of body weight. And most people are under on that, so it's easy to pump that up. Most people are over on carbs and over on fat and over on macros and over on sugar and under on fiber. It's like it's fairly straightforward, but there are fringe use cases where I've spoken to people who are struggling and they've run a generic heuristic, and you look at their diet and you're like, yo, you're some like keto paleo guy, right? Like you're not Tristan Lee, friend of the show, classic example. They
Yeah.
gave that kid a carb, he was like 190.
Yeah, dude.
Like what the fuck? Like the number of times people had to reiterate like this kid's actually not on drugs. Well, he was. The drug was C6H12O6 carbohydrates. Like that was the drug because he was eating fucking deer pancreas for breakfast and lunch and whatever the fuck that kid was doing. God love that kid. But it's
Yeah.
like, so I think there is a, like you said, you alluded to this, like the baseline level of knowledge that gets put out in the industry now is so much higher than what it used to be.
Yeah.
But the ability to discern that information is still as low as it's ever been.